So my title, Toxic Masculinity. So you know how like you write a thing and you gotta come up with a title? And so I spent like a day trying to come up with this title. And it works, right? It's a fine title. I was just trying to come up with something that was catchy enough and fit on the fly. But I'm unhappy with the word toxic and anti-colonialism, and I'm not totally thrilled with the word Navajo. So most of this isn't great. Right? The reason I'm not thrilled with toxic is because what I really mean is toxify. And I want to really talk about the agencies behind this toxification, right? This stuff didn't just become toxic somehow. This stuff was made toxic, right? So that's part of what I want to talk about. Toxified instead of toxic. And anti-colonialism, I don't know if the movie's anti-colonial. I know that it's a really strong statement of indigenous gendered identities, but I don't know if it's trying to be anti-colonial. I think it might just be trying to be indigenous. And because we exist within a settler colonial state, that comes off as really anti-colonial. But again, not totally sold that that's what it's doing. In fact, I would probably argue that it's not what it's doing, but I'm open on that one. And then Navajo, because I'm going to be switching back and forth between Navajo and Dene, which is their name for themselves. But the movie is totally called Drunktown's Finest, so, so we're good there. All right. In my book, Positive Pollutions and Cultural Toxins, I define cultural toxins as those elements of our culture that kill or make more of it. They are those cultural elements that lead people to behaviors that destroy and sicken. United States settler colonialism, like all colonialisms and imperialisms, is rife with specific manifestations of cultural toxicity. Today I'm going to focus on one such element, toxic masculinity, and offer the feature film Drunktown's Finest as a study in the threats of this toxic masculinity as well as technique by which to counter it. I argue that this film serves as an indigenous statement about positive gender constructions and performances as a mode of decolonization that the film also demonstrates need never have been necessary, denaturalizing colonial hegemonic heteropatriarchy. So, here's my book. Here's a definition of toxic masculinity. It's just something to work with. This is actually from a Salon article. Toxic masculinity has been pretty seriously under-theorized. We all kind of know it when we see it, right? And we can understand that there are elements of the kinds of masculinity that are expected, that are toxic, that are destructive. But it's an under-theorized thing, so my next project is really working at theorizing and complicating notions of what toxic masculinity really means. This research is growing kind of on the heels of a recent upsurge in indigenous masculinity studies. Right, we hear masculinity studies and we are prone to be thinking like, oh, is this going to be some like men's rights garbage? Right? That was my concern when these two books came out. Right? I was like, oh no, don't do it. But what they're dealing with really is the way that patriarchy has been laying over indigenous communities, right? And the ways that these manifestations of toxic masculinity have become commonplace in indigenous communities in really, really recent history. And so I kind of start with this quote as a bit of an epigraph. It's a relatively new thing in Indian country, patriarchy. We forget, because it's such a dominant system in the world, we forget that it really isn't everything and everywhere. Our people weren't living this way, even in recent history. What I love about this quote is the use of the word forget. Right? We had this different way, and we forgot. Right? So it's not about needing to assert some entirely new notion of gender into indigenous communities, but remembering, right? Or refusing to forget. And that's something that we're going to see. Excuse me, I'm getting over some weird cough thing, so bear with me. But it's something that we're going to see over the course of looking at scenes from this film. Oh, here's a couple of recent books. Really, really good. Masculinity is actually a collection of interviews. And then the Alexander and Innes book, this one right here, is a collection of essays. So both edited collections, and they're great because they give a lot of different voices about the role of masculinity across, roles of masculinities across many Native communities. This work also grows out of the fact that we have a masculinity problem in Native film. And what I mean by that is that a whole lot of Native film, the preponderance of Native American film is seriously masculinist. And this is kind of a, if you're doing a Native film class, these are the films you're choosing from. Right? This is kind of the greatest hits. Right? Smoke Signals, absolute classic, right? Everybody in Indian country can recite Smoke Signals anytime they want. The movies with asterisks by them are the movies with female protagonists. All the other ones have male protagonists. So it's indicative of a problem. A problem that might be getting a little bit better, but still of a problem. And I want to argue that Drumtown's Finest is interceding in that, is making a contribution, is serving as a corrective. There's the poster. You can't read it, but you're going to have to trust me that this thing right here says, without balance we cannot endure. And this is something I want to come back to again and again over the course of this talk. The film tags itself as without balance we cannot endure. This is going to be important as we look at the issues that the film itself is treating. Anybody in here seen it? All right, you should. It's cool. It's good. Check it out. You're going to see a fair amount of it today, to be honest. It's set in Gallup, New Mexico. Directed and written by Sidney Freeland, who's Diné or Navajo, who also produced a digital short series called Her Story, set in Los Angeles. Really cool short series dealing with the kind of intersecting lives of a group of trans women and queer women in Southern California. Really, really good. You can like binge watch this thing in like 3 hours, the entire first series of it. The film Drumtown's Finest revolves around these three characters. Felicia John, this is from left to right up here. Felicia John, who's a noble, it's defined in the film as third gender, sex worker with modeling aspirations. Luther Maryboy, also known as Sick Boy, who's this expectant father dealing with his, really dealing with the major elements of toxic masculinity within the film. He's also about to ship off for basic training, supposedly. And Najoni Smiles, who is a young Diné woman who was adopted by white parents, who instilled in her a fear of, reservation spaces and Native people. All right, so I want to open here with his first scene. This is going to be a sunrise over Gallup, New Mexico, with a voiceover from Najoni.
They say this land isn't a place to live, it's a place to leave. Then why do people stay?
I have sung as low as a man could go. The world has turned me down, and you pick me up, and you kiss me sweet, and change a beggar into a king. Yes, you took the red right off of my back, and you gave me love to keep me warm. Yes, you picked me up, and you kissed me sweet, and changed a beggar to a king. Kiss me sweet and change a beggar into a king.
So I want to start with addressing those opening lines. They say this land isn't a place to live, it's a place to leave. stay. Important first part of that. It's not talking about Gallup, right? It's not they say this town isn't a place to live, right? It's they say this land isn't a place to live, right? This is about space. And this is what we see in the course of this opening montage is it opens over Gallup. Gallup is called Drunktown. It kind of stems from this 2020 bit from years ago where they addressed alcoholism in Gallup, New Mexico and called it Drunktown. So Friedland is riffing off of that. Riffing off of this narrative of Gallup, Broadway, and Navajo Nation itself as these kind of tragic spaces. And the opening nods toward that. They say this land isn't a place to live. It's a place to live. But also the fact that people stay. So the film is telling us that it's going to get at why people say it's a place to live and why people say it's a place to leave. Right? It's also going to get to who exactly these people are who say this land isn't a place to live. That opening montage begins with that voiceover, and it starts with some images that give us that kind of re-articulate that narrative of place to leave. Right? We see people being arrested, we see homeless people, we see the drunk tank, we see gang activity, right? We see these things. At the same time, we see people reading, we see the mural of the code talkers, we see some guys sort of just skating and then mugging for the camera, getting all kind of verite up in here, right? Verite up in here. We see kids jumping on a trampoline, right? And specifically Native kids on the reservation playing on a trampoline, right? So there are these elements of the film that are already telling us it's a place to live. It opens with that dawn scene, right? And the role of dawn is going to become important over the course of the film. But just the visual of that wide shot time lapse of the clouds dissolving into a blue sky and a sunny day. This is invoking images of hope, right? When we talk about the place to live versus the place to leave, it's important that this is set specifically at Navajo Nation. And for those who don't know, right, this visual up here, that's Navajo Nation, that big yellow thing. Navajo Nation is roughly the size of West Virginia. For those of you from the Northeast, it's roughly the size of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts combined. Right? So we're talking about a great big landmass. And in terms of a Native community in the United States maintaining that size of landmass, Navajo Nation is unique. We're not talking about a relocated community. Not permanently relocated, right? Certainly there are satellite communities, certainly boundaries have been imposed on Navajo Nation. But the fact that the Navajo people have been in this place as they see it since the literal dawn of time, that matters. This is not a relocated population. They're talking about their homeland. This right here is a map of Navajo Nation. This little section right here, it's kind of hard to see unless you're in the first row, probably. There's a little section here that's not Navajo Nation, this little like surrounded spot. That's Gallup, New Mexico. That's where the film is set. So it's this town that's not in Navajo Nation, but is completely surrounded by Navajo Nation. And that's going to be important too for the way that the novel, or the way that the film and the narrative pan out. Of course, we got some famous shots. This is Shiprock up here. Monument Valley down here. Anybody seen any John Ford movies, John Wayne movies? They're all set right here. There's a movie, Stagecoach. They're supposed to be going from like Missouri to Arizona, I think. They just keep going in circles around. This is called the Mittens right here. They just go around in circles around the Mittens for like 2 hours. Right? And so it's kind of become a joke in Navajo Nation. They're like, this is a problem with white people. They have no idea where they're going, right? These sections, these kind of panoramic shots from the northern section of Navajo Nation. So these are up here, as opposed to where the film is set down here. This right here, the Great Seal. You see that the seal is enclosed by the 4 sacred peaks of Navajo Nation. We've got the animals, we've got the corn growing, we've got the sun as sacred. All of this is invoking an indigenous tie to place. That this is a nation that defines itself very much as place and also as bounded to the other than human. When we talk about toxification, in Navajo Nation, one of the first things we think about is uranium. Obviously, I've got a ton of statistics about this. I don't want to get into it because this is going to make my talk run too long. But the dots on this map are abandoned uranium mines on Navajo Nation. The red dots are locations where the gamma radiation is over 10 times the background radiation. These are currently existing sites. So when we talk about the toxic land, this is part of what we're talking about. We might think of uranium mining, we might think of the Animas River spill. This happened about a year ago, the same time that the media was learning about the media, like that's a thing, right? That popular mainstream media was telling the story about water contamination in Flint. This was going on. So of course one of the questions around Indian country is, why isn't this story told? Why do we only have the capacity for one narrative about toxification of water? Why do we see these as isolated incidents instead of manifestations of systemic issues, especially involving communities of color? So the Animas spill, this started up in Colorado, spread all along right here. This is the Animas River at the northern boundary of Navajo Nation. Made the water look like this. That effect is called yellow boy. It's iron hydroxide in the water. Just in case you thought it was it's in large quantities, that's a smaller quantity of it. It's heavy metal toxification of the water that is, of course, the drinking water for many people in Navajo Nation, also the water for agriculture and for livestock. So this is an economic as well as an environmental health issue. It's kind of eerily pretty, right? It's this weird thing. That would be beautiful if we didn't know just how toxic that is. I want to return to this idea of this as a place to leave, specifically in terms of the internalization of that idea of a place to leave within a couple of characters. So in this scene, we're going to see Sick Boy and Felicia toward the tail end of a party.
It's the last one. It's supposed to be only 10 minutes now.
You've been saying that all night, Smelly.
This time was me. You want to hear something funny? When I was growing up, I used to think that being a drunk was just a part of life everyone went through.
What do you mean?
I mean, first you were a kid, and then you hit puberty, then you became a drunk. And if you made it, you became an adult. So I'm used to becoming adults and shit, getting the fuck out of here.
Damn.
I took a guess.
This notion of being a drunk as a rite of passage. This is what you do before you become an adult, right? If you make it. This is about the internalization of a kind of toxic notion of adulthood. This is especially relevant in light of the fact that this film is going to turn on Max's little sister's kinalta, or puberty ceremony. A whole lot of the action of the film circles around getting prepared for his little sister's puberty ceremony. So for him to see becoming a drunk as the rite of passage versus the other rite of passage that we're going to see in the film, right? It exemplifies this juxtaposition. He has absolutely internalized this toxic notion that is about specifically taking toxins into the body, right? Toxifying oneself. Well, we also see that he toasts to becoming adults and, quote, getting the fuck out of here. So his idea is that not just you become a drunk and then become an adult, but you become an adult and then you leave. There's something in his mind about adulthood and then this being a place to leave, right? Always about getting out. And what we're going to see over the course of the film, over the course of my talk, is that that idea is actually opposed profoundly by a Diné worldview that emphasizes responsibility. Sick Boy's goal is to leave, always to leave. And that's not just about getting out of Gallup. It's not just about leaving the reservation. He's always absent. He's absent in his relationships. He's absent everywhere. And the only way he makes his presence known is through physical violence. Felicia shares that worldview. Right? The idea is to get out. And so what we're going to see over the course of this is the ways that that changes and the reasons that that changes. And what I'm going to argue is the reason that that changes is because they stop seeing themselves as isolated individual selves. What they're doing is turning away from liberal humanism and turning to a collectivity that recognizes that they are part of bigger things than that. Scott Morgenson argues, this is one of the essays in the Indigenous Masculinities collection, the liberal humanist appeal to the individual is more succinctly an appeal to an idealized, universal European masculinity where European bourgeois heterosexual masculinity came to represent humanity. This gets overlain on top of Native communities. Many, many, many of which, including Navajo, were matrilineal, matrifocal, and matriarchal. We're going to see some of the ways that that exists within Diné communities as we go. So there's this liberalism that's privileged within sort of mainstream US, but that focus on the individual simply rings false in Navajo Nation as well as in countless indigenous communities. There's another quote from this from that collection that says, that's talking about health. They're talking about the health of the individual. And this person says, you're only as healthy as the collective. You're only as healthy as Mother Earth and all our relations. Right? And that notion, all our relations, that's a nod to a Dakota, Lakota, Nakota breeding. Right? Where you call out all my relations. And so that collectivity that we see throughout indigenous communities that we're going to see exemplified in a couple of the conversations that I'm going to show here are not just about the self to other people, but about self to everything around you. To other people, to relatives, to the other than human, to physical space, all of those things seen as part of the self, specifically in the mode, I'm going to argue, of kinship. The indigenous masculinity we get with instead is this notion of the warrior. And this is what Sick Boy has internalized the most. First is a quote from Tayaki Alfred. Argues that for the violence of conquest, you needed a violent opponent. So you created this image of the native as a violent warrior. The way to confront that and to defeat it and to recover something meaningful for natives is to put the image of the native male back into its proper context, which is the family. If we're not talking about the native male as part of something bigger than himself, we're doing it wrong. One of the legacies of colonization, this is Negon Sinclair, one of the legacies of colonization has been the separation of men from their roles within the families, communities, and nations. That men have bought into this, right? And in some instances out of material necessity, right? But that men start to see themselves as warriors more than anything else, right? As violent instead of as caretakers. And what these critics are pointing out is that warrior was not an identity among most Native communities. Warrior was something you did sometimes when you had to. It wasn't something that you were. It was something you performed. It was also something for which you were chosen, not something for which you chose yourself, right? The emphasis on the community claiming you. Right? And of course, I picked these just as these are the most common representations that people see of Native identities. Right? These kind of pop cultural things, including this one. Take a guess who I'm rooting for in the World Series. I mean, it's always going to be the National League anyway. But. Sick boy, as I mentioned, right, he's about to ship off for basic. When we first meet Sick boy, he is drunk, being kicked out of a liquor store that refuses to sell to him, urinating on the side of said liquor store when the police roll up. Cop comes up to him, starts to talk to him. Sick boy drunkenly slaps at him, gets arrested. Important that the officer is not only Native, but like kind of rocking the traditional bun, the whole thing, right? He gets arrested. The next morning, his recruiting officer shows up and says, you get so much as a parking ticket between now and Monday when you ship out. Over the next 3 days, you get so much as a parking ticket and we're done. This is the scene that follows that. All right, so we've met Sick boy as drunk and violent.
Jesus.
You stink.
Good to see you too. What are you doing with us?
It's for summer school. We're learning animals.
Alright. Let's see what you got.
Should I chomp? Nashchunitsa. I don't know that one.
Jean.
Jean.
Delohi.
Delohi.
Jean. Delohi.
Jean. Delohi.
Means nose like a rope. Is Angela inside?
Yeah.
Is she mad?
We're about to learn that Angela is his wife, that she's pregnant. But what we see here is such a contrast for Sick boy. What we see here is him engaging in caregiving. He is taking care of Max, his little sister, of whom he has legal custody because the courts determined that she was better off with him than with his mother. The fact that she's studying flashcards of animals matters, right? Could have selected anything, picked animals. There's something framing this within relations to the other than human that we're going to see throughout the film. I'm not just sort of pulling this one out abstractly. That matters. We see him breaking, really for the only time early in the film, from the toxic masculinity that he manifests throughout the rest. That he is performing as caregiver, as teacher, sitting with her on the steps, holding these flashcards. And we look at the scene itself of the flashcards being held in his hands, that he is carrying these lessons for her. We also see that he is engaged in language learning. Right? He knows these words. The first word, dog. Right? Kind of a nod to the ubiquity of the res dog, right? The second one, the mountain lion. Puma or catamount or panther, depending on where you're from, or painter, as they say some places, right? Also indigenous to this land. The third one is elephant. How many languages do you know the word elephant in? It's not a common one, right? The fact that Sick boy knows the word elephant is impressive, right? It takes his language knowledge to kind of another level. The elephant is not indigenous to Diné country, right? He not only knows the word, he teaches her. He knows how to break down the word, he knows what the word means at its root, but also teaches her the mnemonic for remembering it. This is passionate, compassionate caregiving. This is a beautiful scene, right? Of Diné Bizaad, the Navajo language being passed belong. Right? And this concept of language maintenance and language revitalization is fundamental across Native communities, because the attempts to exterminate those languages have been conscious by the settler state to remove Native people from their cultures, right? The fact that it's ongoing and the sick boy is taking part of it makes him less sick boy, right? Makes him more Luther Mary boy. Max's gender ambiguous name matters too, as an aside. When he goes inside and he talks to Angela, she says, what if you're, I heard you, first of all, I heard you shot a cop. He's like, no, I just like slapped him. She's like, oh, you just slapped him. Great. What if your recruiter finds out? He's like, he knows, he got me off, we're good. She's like, what are you doing? He's like, do you even know why I'm joining the military? It's for us. Once these checks start rolling in, shit's gonna change. That's his quote. And so what we see with Sick Boy is that his notion of providing for people is not about being physically present, right? He's gonna go off to basic, and then, let's be real, I don't know if y'all heard, we're engaged in some military action around the world. There's a reasonable chance he's gonna be shipped off, right? So his notion of providing care is not to be there, but to provide financially. This is a manifestation of toxic masculinity. That your primary role is not emotional. It's not being present. That there are more important things for you to do. We understand the economic realities. Native people enlist in the military at the highest rates of any population in the country. The next populations, Puerto Rican, Samoan, Womack. Colonized populations under the United States' umbrella. Right? And the following groups, other communities of color. We understand this. We understand the economic realities. We understand the material truth that many people in these communities see these as the only careers with the possibility of advancement. That's why my father served. Sick Boy sees that as what he can contribute. But we see in this scene that he has so much more to give. He sees his role as being the warrior. When he shows up with Max's moccasins for her canalda, this is a scene right after he has met with his mother and his mother's partner, who he had a very violent physical altercation with. And then he shows up with these moccasins for Max.
Came by to drop these off for my sister. How you doing?
Good. I have to wear this cord.
Cool. Need anything?
No, you can just leave my shoes over there.
She's working right now. I told her that the harder a young woman works during these next 4 days, the stronger in life she will be.
Yeah, what are you all doing with her?
We're sharing stories with her and teaching her what it means to be a non-whole woman. Let my husband know you stopped by. He's the medicine man, and he'll want to talk to you.
Luther Mary boy. Max's brother.
Armin John. You know I'm going in the army? Come over here. Sure. You want to learn what it is to be a warrior?
Never thought about it like that, but I guess, yeah.
Two things make a warrior. A true warrior.
Yeah, what's that?
First, a warrior must know how to fight for and protect those who cannot defend themselves. Army taught me this well. Learn how to fight, shoot, how to survive. But anybody can fight. The second part's the hardest.
What's that?
They say the mark of a true warrior is one who knows when to retreat.
Retreat? Man, how's that a good thing? It's like losing. Yeah, I'm over here with the medicine man. I dropped off massive moxidants.
Get home now. Somebody broke into the apartment.
What?
Get home now.
Kind of like Superman take, right? Bolting off screen. Several things I want to point to. The opening scene, he arrives at the Canonda and he doesn't know what's going on. In Diné tradition, men also have Canondas. It's clear that Luther, sick boy, right, didn't. Right? And he's removed from this, right? So as much as there are things like he knows Diné Vizad, he speaks the language, there are also all kinds of things that he doesn't know about, all kinds of elements of belonging in the community that he doesn't understand. Excuse me. I wanted to point out the way that he introduces himself. It's going to become a point in a second, right? He walks up and he says, Luther Marigold. So first of all, he's introduced himself as sick boy all throughout the film. Everyone has called him sick boy. This is the first time that we have seen him call himself Luther Maryboy. The only other time he's been called Luther Maryboy was when he was in holding cell. Hailed into being, right? So he introduces himself by that name. And there are a whole bunch of elements that to a Diné greeting that aren't comprised in that we're going to pay attention to. But it's just important that that's an individual, kind of westernized greeting. Westernized, right? Like it came from somewhere west of Navajo Nation. I mean, if you're a farmer, it's a circle. But, you know. Harlan asks him, you want to learn what it is to be a warrior? So I've never really thought about it like that, but I guess. And the film is relying on these tight shots. It starts off with this wide shot of all the action taking place, and it kind of moves back and forth between those wide shots, those establishing shots, framing everybody within this physical landscape, right? With Max in the background grinding corn. And then these tight shots going back and forth between Harlan and Sick Boy. Harmon and Sick Boy. He asks him if he knows what it means to be a warrior. He rolls up his sleeve, shows that he was airborne, and explains, I know what I'm talking about. First, to protect people other than yourself, those who can't defend themselves. And Sick Boy thinks he was just doing this because he assaults his mother's partner after he has abused his child, right? We think maybe this is Sick Boy's half-brother. Hard to tell, right? So what Sick Boy does is he just jumps him and he pounds him into the parking lot. We don't feel terrible about this until we pan to the shot of that 6-year-old child watching his father get beaten. And we realize that this isn't helping anyone. That Sick Boy's not protecting anyone, he's just acting on his rage. And we know, of course, anybody who knows anything about abuse, that this isn't going to make any better. That, Sick Boy's mother's partner has also, by this point in the film, filed charges against Sick Boy. Those charges are going to mean that Sick Boy will be disqualified from service. And so while Harmon is giving him all this information about what it means to be a warrior, we also know, if we've watched the movie more than once, that Sick Boy's never going to be a soldier. This information will never serve him as a soldier, because he's never going to be one. But it might serve him as a warrior. Knowing when to retreat. What does that mean? It means knowing what fights to not wage. Knowing that just because you see an act of violence does not mean you respond with an act of violence. That's the cycle of toxic masculinity. Sick boy runs home, realizes that the people who broke into his house were the friends of another guy he got into a fight with. Got 3 fights in like the first 45 minutes of the film. The police show up for that and then arrest him for the other fight in the parking lot with his mother's partner. I want to contrast this, contrast Sick Boy and demonstrate what the film is showing us in terms of Sick Boy and the ways that his approaches don't work, particularly through the foil of Felicia. We first meet Felicia, I mentioned earlier, she's a sex worker. She's with a client in the first scene in his car. But I wanted to show, this is the second scene that we meet with her. She sneaks into her bedroom window, and then it sort of pans around her walls. And we see pictures of models everywhere on her walls, as well as a calendar, Women of the Navajo Nation.
Oh, woman. I'll be right with you. I just have to finish this burrito for Grandpa. Bye. Cheers, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right. So of course, the first thing we notice is the pop-ups, right? The Facebook Messenger pop-ups. It's definitely Facebook, and definitely everything that marks it as Facebook has been removed, right? So I'm gonna call it Fakebook, because it's obviously Facebook, right? And so we see Felicia interacting with people. We understand that there's something covert, right? She keeps doing these furtive glances over her shoulder, looking at her grandmother, who we never forget is there, grayed out behind the pop-up, right? So it's this almost like green screen effect, but in a contemporary digital sense. One of the things that's important about all these characters, Felicia particularly, when I talked before about Native film and its masculinist tendencies, right? It's specifically hetero-masculinist nostalgia. Right? That there was kind of a better time, not that long ago, right? But the warriors of before were better. And so this film's focus on a multi-gendered millennial cast is doing something different. Felicia here is interacting with people the way lots of people interact, right? Having relationships with people that are sometimes even entirely digital. I feel like I've known Julie for years and years and years. We met today, right? That's a little more complicated than just digital, but we know people who we've never met, right? We're friends with people with whom we've never met. And this film is representing that connections are made in ways that aren't necessarily physical. But this digital mediation that we're seeing here is going to be really, really important. It's a digital mediation that is actually establishing human-to-human relationships. Everybody she meets with throughout the course of the movie is also Navajo. All of these interactions are happening in Navajo Nation. And so it might seem like this is a mode of distancing, but it's not. It's simply a different way of being traditionally Navajo. Right? That it's reclaiming that digital media as traditional. And what we're going to see is that Felicia is this really traditional character. We meet her like this. And we might think, oh, that's somehow weird, somehow different. Right? When the pop-ups come up, right, you're watching this movie on your laptop, and that happens, you're like, wait, who's messaging me? You're like, oh no, wait, that's actually part of the film. So that's something different that's happening with Felicia as a character. But I want you to pay attention to that word, mediated. Right? Felicia as mediated, and specifically as mediating. and particularly in terms of her role as traditional. Right, we've met Ruth here before. We know that Grandpa is the medicine man. That these are her grandparents raising her, right? It's yet another example of the absent parent. But the young person who is not devoid of parental figures nonetheless. Just because you don't have that kind of parent doesn't mean you don't have parents, right? I want to talk about the way that this film counters notions of nostalgia and toxic masculinity, especially by uniting its primary characters at Sick Boy's Sisters Canalda, replete with these multi-layered images of futurity. I assert that these characters, despite their struggles, come to conceptualize their understandings of belonging through family, broadly construed. In other words, this feature posits specifically Diné, but also broadly indigenous kinship as a set of enduring, vibrant, lived relations, a set of collective responsibility. Diné theorist Glenn Coulthard explains, quote, "The land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating, non-exploitative terms." Coulthard sets up these indigenous cultural traditions as contrasts, non-dominating, non-exploitative, to settler heteropatriarchies replete with masculinist dominance and exploitation. I want to assert that this emphasis on relationality is always fluid, and emphasize that the film privileges the centering of community, working to demonstrate the shortcomings of liberal humanist privileging of selfhood fostered by settler hegemonies. Felicia becomes a mediator for this. Right? Felicia and Nadle people become a mediator for this, as we're going to see. But before we do that, I want to talk about her. Right? She's the only one who has these digital interactions on screen. The only one with that kind of diegetic presence. The other characters, Nijoni, for example, she's trying to find out who her biological family is. She relies on native informants to do it. Right? So she's not even trying to Google her parents' names. We never even see that. So that Felicia's the only one with this kind of digital mediation is especially important in light of this. This is the audition for the Women of the Navajo calendar.
I'm sorry, I don't speak Navajo. Thank you. Please head through those doors. Wait, that's it? Next.
I would just like to say that it is an honor to be here. I know that I can represent the Navajo women as both sovereign and self-determined. I'm sorry, can you repeat that in English?
Thank you. You can head through those doors and pick up your headshot.
Next.
Hello, my name is Chef Felicia Johnny Chef. Sanjikina Sinajini, Bashachi, Madishkishni, Bashache, Honagakni, Bashanana.
Finally, someone who can speak Navajo. I tell you, beautiful girls are a dime a dozen. But the women in this calendar must represent us. And if they can't even speak their own language, how can they call themselves Diné?
I was raised by my grandparents. They're pretty traditional.
If you were to get a spot on this calendar, would you consider changing your hair back to its original color?
Yes, of course. Anything I can do to be a model.
Perfect. Can you come back tomorrow for some photo tests?
I got a whole thing about the way he hits the word original on hair color there. And somebody else talks about natural hair color later on. Something about natural hair. Whole big thing going on with that. We don't have time. I want to talk about, instead, we think back to the scene with the flashcards. We think back to the importance of language. Right? Because we understand, right? Those of us who study language understand what language carries. That language carries value. That language carries meanings. Far beyond whatever explicit in the language. Also the greeting. Think back to that greeting where Sick Boy and Harley meet each other. This is the traditional Diné greeting. You say your name, and then you say your clans. Starting with your mom's clan, then your dad's clan, then your mom's mom's clan, and then your dad's dad's clan. Right? So going back, who am I? I am a person who comes from these people. But the Diné clans aren't just about the people you come from. The Diné clans are based on the place. specifically where your people are from, often where your people emerged into this world, going back to the origins of humanity in this world, not creation because we existed in a world below this world, something like that. The origin into this world itself. Where are you from? Who are you from? And that doesn't mean who do you claim. That means who claims you. That you belong to things that are bigger than you. Atishtonen. What are your clans? And when you meet somebody from your clan, you call them brother or sister. The notion of cousin, right, that we have in English, it totally doesn't work for almost anybody, right? We all have cousins and aunties and stuff that aren't biologically related to us. And we all recognize chosen family, everybody in the world. But the notion of cousin doesn't work, right? The people who we would call cousins in this kind of context, you would call brother and sister in Diné. And cousin is anybody from your clan. Atishtonen. Who are you from? We see Felicia as this traditional character, and this continues in terms of her role and gender identity here, gender positionality.
Cheers. Isn't it prayer? On the New York.
Yes. What are y'all dressed up for?
Puberty ceremony. Fourth night tonight. Tomorrow morning, sunrise ceremony. Will you be able to join us?
Apollo babies on my bed.
Grandma ever tell you the story about my clan, the river?
I don't think so.
Well, a long time ago, all Navajo lived alongside the great river. The men, women, and the Nocturnal. One day they began to argue over who was more important than the other. The men said they were because they hunted, and the women said they were because they tended the crops. On and on they argued until finally they decided maybe they were better off without each other. The men rafted across the great river and took the hot clay with them. And for a while, everything was fine. And the men began to miss their wives and children, but they were too proud to go back. And they sent the Nocturnal back to check on them. And Nocturnal returned with the message that things weren't so well with the women. That they missed the men. That they had no one to hunt with them. It became apparent both sides needed each other. The men needed the women. And women in turn needed the men. And they both needed the Nocturnal. This day we carry this lesson, this balance. And I know you're struggling with acceptance. This world can be cold and hard on our people. But you must always remember, wherever you go, whatever you choose to do, you always have a home.
To this day, we carry this lesson, this balance. What is important about this lesson, this balance, is it's not two binaries in tension with each other, right? Multiple nodes that keep each other, that define each other, but that make each other whole. there was a time when this notion of gendered superiority took hold. And the people have a story about that time, so that we don't make that mistake again. Her grandfather comes in and says, "You will always have a place. I know that you are struggling with acceptance. And this world can be cold, hard on our people. But that struggle for acceptance is not here. The world can be cold and hard on us. We don't make it cold and hard on each other. You have a home here," right? He says, "this place for you." Right? He's not talking about the trailer. Right? He's talking about the nation. This is home. And you are always to be claimed here. There's something going on here with generational expectation, right? We might not expect the elderly grandfather, this bastion of Navajo conservatism, to be as open and loving with his trans daughter. Granddaughter, excuse me. But what we see is that Diné conservatism is not transphobic. It's not homophobic. That's not traditional Navajo. That was imposed. So what we're seeing, when I say that this is an indigenous film, when I say I don't want to claim it as decolonial or anti-colonial, it's maybe decolonizing. But it's really just this statement of indigeneity saying this is what we believe. These are our cores. These are our traditions. And they are about balance. And they are about a specifically gendered balance that always privileges this place. Your relationship as always defined in space and place. I'll move now to just this final scene. The last scene of the movie, this is Max's Keynote. Sunrise ceremony.
Hey, can you look here?
No, I'm here with my family.
Majoni, you made it. This is Felicia. She's your cousin.
You mean like cousins or Navajo cousins?
Your mother and her mother were sisters. You're real cousins.
Nice to meet you too.
Oh. How are these fine young men and women?
I want you to meet someone.
Oh, granddaughter. It's been a long time. Good to see you. Oh. Oh, the eagle coming to visit us. You know what that means?
Now what?
Sign of good things to happen.
things I want to point to, right? We see all the hope of that final scene, the community together, the sunrise as emblematic of becoming something anew, this as a puberty ceremony, this young woman becoming an adult, becoming a woman, right? And the whole community being there. Everybody running with her down the road, right? And they're rocking their mocks, but also their Uggs and their Chucks and their Jordans, because it's now, right? And these are living native people looking not just at the present, but toward the future, right? That one's counter to so many stereotypes that people hold about Native people. Think about how often people will willingly discuss Native Americans as if they exist only in the past. Native American people believed that. We hear things like that all the time, right? But also, all the family at the beginning of this scene. Najoni pulls up and says, "Do you live here?" He's like, "No, I'm just here with my family." What family? Doesn't need to be defined. Not important. It's just I'm here with my family. I kind of got beef with the, wait, like cousin or not real cousins? No, she's your real cousin, right? Because the indication is that cousin can mean so many different things. But it's done tongue-in-cheek, right? It's a joke. And the conversation's taking place in English, so whatever. Away with it. This is the first time that these characters are coming together. And we see that they are united by these bonds of kinship that are complicated. The subtitles are slightly wrong. When he looks up and says the eagle, he says, "Oh, brother eagle, come to visit." Brother eagle. That's kin too. Right? And that the run takes place here in this land. We wait for the sunrise. When does the sun rise? The sun rises when it rises over this horizon. That's all that matters. And it's not at a clock time. It's about a lived experiential time. So that, all these kinds of kinship and all these kinds of hope coming together in these final moments. The film begins with so much toxic. Addiction, violence, isolation, distance, and ends with so much hope. But we have to remember that the film moves from dawn to dawn. The hope has always been there. The cold open shows the land and the people, the Diné and their relations clouded over but emerging. One of the things I love about Drunktown's Finest is that unlike so many Native American movies, nobody dies. It's important that nobody's born either. All that happens is young people, multi-gendered millennial characters come to understand their selfhoods can never be rightly understood out of the context of family, which again is less about blood than it is about caregiving. The isolation of the self, the presumption that we aren't always already bound to others, the human, the other than human, the geological, the spiritual, and the sacred, that's the cultural toxin. Toxic masculinity is one symptom of humanism's hegemonic reach, itself a tactic of settler colonial strategy. But Drunktown's Finest shows us that Diné people have actively worked to avoid and or combat specifically hierarchical disassociation. Barry Commoner taught us long ago that the first law of ecology is that everything is connected to everything else, right? I want to say that everyone is connected to everyone else. And that change from one to thing is not to take away the things, but to understand the selfhood in the things. Countless indigenous cultures have always recognized this. In Drunktown's Finest, we see that connection couched in terms of kinship. And kinship here entails responsibility, it entails caregiving, it entails presence, and it entails balance. What it requires, I want to argue, is love. Radical, indigenous love. Where kinship represents not a finishing line, but a starting point. A greeting, if you will. Atish Tome. What are your clans? It's more than about who are your people. It's about who you are from and where you are from. It's about what is your context. There's a saying I grew up with. Dime con quien andas y te diré quién eres. Tell me who you go with. Tell me who you walk with, and I'll tell you who you are. Tell me what your context is, and I will tell you who you are. That is what defines you. Tell me who your context is. Atish Tone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
get to as many questions as possible, so I'm going to turn it over immediately to our first question.
I just saw a comment that you mentioned that it's important to read yourself as well as how slow and deliberate when speaking, and how like there was a movie.
Yeah, I mean that deliberateness of speaking. That in so many indigenous cultures, one is supposed to be deliberate with one's words. And that is, again, about that responsibility, right? That your desire to speak is not more important than the words you choose.
Thank you very much for that. I had a kind of question that when you were showing us the scene with the gentleman and the young woman drinking together, and where he's clearly not feeling on top of the world, and you made this very, I thought valid, interesting, moving connection between toxic and toxifying habit, ingestion, and all the rest that, what do you see as different or continuity, or where in the spectrum do you see the woman? Where do you see femininity in that? Because she doesn't seem to think that as far as I saw, I haven't seen the film, she doesn't seem to think that alcoholism or being drunk is a rite of passage.
Right.
Where does she position herself? Where does the director position?
Great question. Yeah, we don't see her abusing alcohol in the same way that we see Sick Boy. Right? She's clearly taken aback by this narrative, right? She doesn't seem to agree with the drunk part, but she definitely agrees with the getting the fuck out of it part. And she's trying to do that throughout the film. It's a surprise that she's still there in the morning, right? When she's talking to her grandfather, she says, "I'll probably be gone by then." She's not only there, but has dyed her hair back to its original color. Right? So she drinks, but doesn't see drinking as who she is. And I think that's an important distinction. When we talk about toxicity, this is what I write about in my book, right? That when we're talking about pollution, the problem is that it foregrounds this notion that there's a pre-existing purity. And that's never existed. We don't even know what that would look like, right? For just a whole host of reasons. And so when we look at toxicity, what we're really looking at is the presence of toxins to a toxic level. So it's not just about a toxin being there, right? In terms of alcohol and alcohol abuse, I think that alcohol can become toxic, but isn't inherently toxic in terms of all of the characters that we see. It's absolutely toxic for Sick Boy, who is just this generally toxic character throughout, who shows these glimpses that doesn't have to be him. And so I would set that up as excuse me, as a contrast.
You said at the time that there's a longer riff about the original hair or later natural hair, and I wondered if you wanted to take some time with Q&A to address that a little.
Yeah. So the guy at the audition, he hits the word original, right? Your original hair color. She's about to fly off to New York to meet with a new client, and she's thinking about dyeing her hair, and she's trying to figure out if she's going to go light or blonde. She said, "I think he'd like blonde." And then her friend says, "Honestly, girl, natural's always been a better one for you." Right? And hands her this box of hair dye. It's not Clairol, but it's like Clarion. It's clearly riffing off of Clairol. It's specifically color number 2, which on the box just says black, but if you look up what Clairion's number 2 hair color is, because I got this kind of time, it's natural black. All right? So it's even coded in this way of emphasizing that there's something authentic, right? And the authenticity discourse in this film troubles me. And I'm sort of presenting all the things that I love about it here today. But that authenticity discourse, because what if you're removed from the language, right? What if you are adopted out? What if you don't speak the language? Like, do you still count as the neck within the worldview of this film? And so it's buying into some of that particular element there. It's also interesting that this trans character is not seen as unnatural in any way, right? So I would assert that that is a value to that naturalistic discourse, but it's also problematic in some other ways that I don't love. Especially because so much of my work is about urban Indian communities. I'm just like, oh, I love this movie, but that's like a little off, you know? Yeah.
I'm really sort of struck by this last scene and interested to know how you read the fact that even sort of in the context of this hopeful dawn and this traditional ritual and the presence of family, that the running away, the running, actually I've already led, the running is still away from home or the place of home.
Mm.
How does that figure into
Right.
the way you read the film?
Yeah, it's interesting. She's going to come back, right? Like part of her run, she's running into the sun, and then she's running back, and she's serving. There's a cake batter that the film has shown her making. That's the actual final stage of all of this, and so we know that her run toward the rising sun is a run literally away from the Hogan. But it's a run that she leads, so if we think of it as a race, it's like she's running away, but it's not a race. Right? She's leading and everyone's running with her, just behind her. Right? So the community is literally going with her. So she's not running away from that. And she's running away from the Hogan, but she's not running off of Navajo land. Right? She's still running in the place. So that last shot, it definitely gives this image of, like, oh, she's leaving. But she's going to come back, and you know that within the context of the film, as well as if you're familiar with the ceremony. So I think it's a really interesting point. Like that scene taken by itself looks like she is doing the kind of leaving that I'm talking about. But she's going to come back, I promise.
2 more questions?
What's the plot twist, or how does the sick boy change? Or does he not change?
Mm-hmm. So the scene before this, so there's a few scenes leading up to this. After he is disqualified from military service, he's hanging out with his friends who are planning a robbery. They're going to knock off the Walmart to steal Sudafed to make meth. And at the beginning of the film, they're asking him specifically which guns they should use to rob the Walmart. He's like, he's like, I don't want any part of this shit. And they say, well, just theoretically, what gun would you use? He's like, if I'm just robbing somebody, a gun's a fucking gun. I could rob somebody with your squirt gun. What I'm worried about is the cops. Right? And so he walks them through why he wants to use one of these guns, because he can get off more shots in case you're in a shootout with the police. And so it's all about like always preparing for violence. He gets disqualified for military service, and then he says, okay, I'm in for this robbery. And he goes out to the Canolda to help, and then he's supposed to leave that night to go and pull the job. But he stays, and specifically chops wood. He goes to talk to Angela, and to try to make peace with Angela. And then he asks if there's anything he can do to help. And they say, yeah, we actually need somebody to split some more wood. So he tries to split wood, and we learn that he doesn't know how. And so one of the Danette characters says, do you even know how to chop wood? And he says, no. One of the men. He says, oh, okay, well, let me teach you. Right? And the sick boy's having a meltdown at this point. He's just kind of swinging wildly at the wood, and just kind of freaking out over his life. And so this man comes in and says, okay, well, let me show you how to do this. And this is really important because the tending of fire is so frequently the job of the masculine within tribal communities. Right? And I keep saying men and women, but these are not like biologically determined in many Native communities, right? So he teaches him how to chop wood. He's teaching him how to tend the fire. And the next scene we see is sick boy falling asleep next to the fire. And so he's chosen to remain. He's chosen to kind of opt out of that robbery and stay with his family. and care in these kind of traditional ways. And I think that's the evolution. So that when, and it's great, because Angela hasn't really forgiven him, but she comes out and he's sleeping in this chair and she just kind of throws a flannel shirt at him. Like, I'm angry at you, but I don't want you to freeze to death. And that's kind of the extent to which they make up over the end of the film, which I also kind of like. But yeah, that he kind of resorbs himself back into the community.
One more. I saw your turn earlier, Gabby.
Yeah. So this is amazing. I really love it in terms, especially like looking at two intersections that people don't often look at in terms of like having like a trans character and also like specifically a story about indigenous people. So like my first reaction was like, why are more people talking about this, sort of like in terms of representation and sort of like the radicalness almost of the representation presented in this film. I mean, like, politics or representation can be problematic, but in this case, like, finding like a trans character, for example, indigenous trans character that's presented in such a nuanced and humanized way, in ways that mainstream LGBTQ media does not often address, because often like they address another form of representation and how, specifically in relation to trans characters, it's so bad, but then nobody mentions this film. Yeah. So I wonder if you can speak more to that.
I don't know. I mean, it's like why don't people talk about more Native film? Like, there's some really cool movies that nobody's seen. I think because when we're talking about the intersections that this film is addressing, it's twice marginalized, and so it's kind of excluding itself from a certain mainstream attention. It's also right. It's a Sundance film. It's produced by Robert Redford. And the director is like, Bob was so great. Dude, you're like that with Robert Redford. That's pretty cool. But that it's gotten a lot of support in those kind of indie circles. But beyond that, like this isn't gonna be a mainstream movie. It's too good.
It kills me to break this off here, but I'm sure I won't be overstepping if I say that John would love to answer questions and continue these conversations in other venues. But I have one final panel for today that is actually in a different location because it is a dance performance and they need a space that is not this like 5x5 square carpet.